This is the 20th of August, and we're together again on a Sunday morning to discuss the mental obsession and do what we can to get better in a discussion about this as authentically and honestly as we can so that we have a better chance of going out into our world for the next 166 hours during the week and interact on a basis that would be more grounded and solid than the one we think exists or only think exists. And that transition isn't required of us, but it is certainly a choice that we make to make believe that somehow or another we're going to turn thoughts into reality when they have no basis in reality, and that would be impossible and insane to even think. And that insanity is effectively what addiction is about. So we talk about it openly because it doesn't seem to be discussed openly, and if it were, there'd be no need to do this or no probably interest in doing this. But the doing of it is the chance as a listener anywhere to just sit in, listen, contemplate, consider, wonder, rather than decide immediately this is crazy or you don't want anything to do with it, but wonder if maybe some of these things that seem complicated aren't simply revealing the complications of the defensiveness and the reactiveness and the impulsiveness and the compulsiveness that are being exposed in the process. If I can think of something accurately, I can quickly see anything I'm doing inaccurately and quickly claim responsibility for that inaccuracy and that action. If I see it as some warped version that I'm trying to induce to keep the lie going, the ideas that I have that aren't true, as though they are true, then I'm creating that obsessive pattern, but I'm always going to have it attached to reactive, impulsive, and compulsive behaviors. Those things are not going to go away until I start getting honest about what's happening. And it doesn't take a lot of honesty to simply admit if you're disturbed that there may be a problem and start to just live with that thought for a little bit. So we're talking about things that are often considered to be subconscious, but I would suggest the subconscious, in my experience, is where I still keep all of the thoughts I have that I know that I'm trying to claim irresponsibility for. Things that aren't right, things that I would be embarrassed to admit I think because they have no basis, things that I would be insane to keep. And so I'm often feeling as though those things are attacking me. And I use words like I'm caught off guard, suggesting at the same time that I'm always on guard to a degree, trying to protect against these things that might be rising to the surface. And to admit the simplicity of something that does not change, an absolute, infinite, all-knowing, omnipotent, omniscient power, or whatever that is, source, force, however it's termed, is to begin to see that simplicity is something that never changes. And that all the complications are not coming from that source. They're not coming from the vastness of my capacity to confuse myself by trying to quantify it, because it's already fully here. It's all that we know. It's the essence of knowing. It's the essence of being. It's the essence of life and love and light. Even light functions on the basis of an absolute nature because it is always going absolutely at light speed. Doesn't go half light speed to get to full light speed. It's constantly doing full light speed, absolute. So we have evidence of the absolute in the universe that we're looking at. This is not a theory. It's actually happening. Now, if you have any light near you, you're seeing it. Travels at 186,000 miles a second, which seems pretty fast to us, but to light, it's not fast at all. It's just what it does. It's what it does. It's how it is. And it's the basis of its substance. If that's the basis of light substance, and we have the potential to be enlightened or brilliant or radiant, then it's that light that we're either expressing or obstructing by making believe it isn't there. And it isn't because the light goes away. It's because we will only act in concert with the ideas we think are true and real when we become embroiled with them. So we use thinking as a potential block when in fact light is never blocked by a thought. It only feels to us as though it is. So that's a little intro. May seem vast, but an infinite capacity isn't even vast. It's just infinite. It's not a spatial thing. If I'm thinking of it as vast, I'm again turning it into thoughts. rather than saying, no, it doesn't have a beginning or end. This completely defies everything I think I've ever known. And yet it must be the basis of everything I've always known, not in thought, but in presence, in absolute knowing. So that's what we talk about. Generally. Sometimes we veer. Sometimes it is not as straight as that, but I don't know that I've got it straight either, but I'm doing what I can to be better at talking about it openly so that we can engage around, rather than stories that excuse why we shouldn't be where we are with what we have, start to actually speak to the present where there is absolutely no story at all. Because if everything's happening in the present, there's no story to tell. It's already happening and everybody's witnessing it. Go ahead, Eden.
That was my question. If this source is simplicity and yet never changes, right? So our thoughts, our ideas complicates it all, and yet it just is. So there really doesn't even have to be a conversation around it.
Yes. Certainly doesn't break itself down into words like thinking does. But keep in mind, we don't actually complicate that absolute source when we're thinking complicated thoughts. We're complicating our thinking and thinking it's the absolute source that's complicated to justify that it's not us doing it. We're constantly looking for an escape route, as though we can escape the things we're doing and causing. Well, think of our brain. That's where the pain and pleasure resides. How far can we get by doing things that appear to be disconnected from us, while in fact that concert is going on immediately as a consequence of what we're thinking in our brain? We're thinking thoughts. It's where pain and pleasure are. Pain is only registered in the brain, by the way. It isn't registered when you stub your toe. The toe's notifying the brain that something's wrong through the nervous system. It isn't the toe that hurts. We know where the pain is coming from because it's a bodily system to help us know what's wrong and that it needs attention, so we can do something about it. If we know what's wrong, what would we want to do but something that's right to heal it? The bodies naturally heal, and yet we undermine every one of its basic bodily systems, metabolic, parasympathetic, nervous system, etc., through stress and anxiety, all caused by thinking about thinking as being the sole source of the universe and real and true, thus thinking we're only what we think. Thus then thinking everything that is contrary to our thinking is an attack, and we need to defend ourselves because we're alone in a world with 8 billion other people thinking differently than we are. And that seems impossible when in fact the impossibility is simply the simplicity of the thought we have, making believe it's true, it's real, when it's simply imagined. It's just a consideration of what's happening. So choices are the decisions we make based on the thinking we do, and choices effectively are will. That's our seeming willpower. We call it willpower because we can enact voluntarily on every voluntary action we ever take starts with a thought, every single one of them. And yet there's all kinds of things going on in our body that are involuntary. We have a whole parasympathetic system that is not a voluntary, it just does what it does. This is more evidence that there is a knowing nature in our universe that our body even contains that absolutely knows what to do. And what we do through anxiety and stress is undermine its ability to function to its capacity, which is exactly what we do with our thinking. It's not thinking, it's misusing the thinking, just like misusing the body by making believe we always need to feel better, when what we're feeling better about is what we're thinking that's worse. All we're doing is getting better at being worse in terms of our human experience. Because eventually it's going to get so bad. Pain is the touchstone of spiritual growth, it said, because it seems that we don't want to respond immediately to what's happening. And responsibility is responsibility. The ability to respond is very different than to react, where we're defensive and automatically coming up with a knee-jerk fight, doing the same thing over and over again, thinking the fight's going to win, rather than saying, wait a minute, maybe there's something here I'm not even considering.
And then what?
A bubble is popped by a needle, not a bat. You can clobber it hard, or a balloon. It's not going to pop, but a little point, the smallest point, will pop it. It's the same thing here. It doesn't take a whole lifetime of changes to simply admit that the present is present, that we're in the present, we're always in the present. There's no other place to be but in the present. And even the thoughts that think we're not in the present, that we create, are in the present thinking we're not in the present. It's just, looking at it accurately, it becomes very silly and laughable. Looking at it inaccurately, it looks very serious, and like our personality is at risk, because the personality we've been posing as, that we appear as, is at risk. Why? Because we can't think constantly and chronically any more than any of us drank chronically. We talked about drinking all the time, but I didn't know anybody that did it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There was always a break where we got to restart again. The moment is the restart. It's always, always, always new. It's always, 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 all that's possible is available. All choices are always available. So to think there's no other choice, Eden and I talked a little bit earlier, is to see how quickly we will use choice to excuse not having any choice, while in fact the choice to think there's no other choice is a choice. It's just, it feeds on itself in either direction. So we can get worse. In the same vein, we can get better. The only difference is getting worse and worse and worse leads to a contraction that gets smaller and smaller and smaller and harder to make smaller. And everything expansive gets easier and easier and easier, because everything gets more and more space and room to function and see clearly. So one is like an impulsion, or a what do you call it? There's expansion, and there's the what did we talk about, Gabe, the other day? It was
the convection conduction, or the explosion?
No, it was an implosion. Yeah. An implosion that eventually becomes an explosion. When some little thing happens that becomes perfectly suited to the time that I have gotten to the point where I cannot any longer implode in myself, and I explode on somebody else for something they've said or done that's so small compared to what I'm feeling. Because the breadth of my feeling is coming from this inner landscape that I've been manipulating in the name of thinking I'm getting better by keeping it smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And eventually it's got to explode. It's kind of like the Big Bang, apparently.
So, question, hypothetically, in a situation where that happens, how, like, can you hypothetically walk me through? It's not even possible, because it's not it's just another idea. Right. I don't really know how to ask this question, so I'm not going to, because it doesn't exist.
Well, don't also minimize we have a lot of imagination that is still impending or pending in our experience, impinging on our experience, because we're still thinking it's true. So the confusion, even if the thing doesn't actually exist, that's a good thing to know, because you've known it all along. But it's also good to begin to recognize the delusional thoughts we've been having and just start to admit, sort of like the mirage in the desert that nobody ever arrived at, the oasis they thought. Isn't it interesting that people dying of thirst in the desert, in the heat, only saw an oasis of palm trees and water in the distance? They didn't see a pizza oven. They didn't see something that made their situation worse. They saw a solution in the distance that could never be achieved and never be reached. And that's exactly what a lie is about. Constantly searching for what can't be found. And in the meantime, saying, I'm lost in thought. I feel lost. I feel disconnected. Of course we feel lost and disconnected. The thoughts we're having have no basis in reality. None. Thoughts are imagined. Thinking may have a basis in reality because it was given to us to help us navigate this experience we're having in a surviving and thriving, rather than imposing suicidal tendencies on ourselves. And compulsions are never, ever actions that are good for us, ever. They're always threatening our survival in some way. We may think of them as small and no big deal, But if you multiply the small thing by 1,000,000 times over 20 or 30 years, it starts to show that there's an impact. We're not going to avoid the impact if we're doing the thing chronically and perpetually and addictively. It's going to show up. It's showing up now, but we've become so desensitized for the most part that we think if we can avoid it by denying it, it isn't happening. And that's the whole cycle, is pretending it's not happening, thinking we're not I suspect we've been doing it for so long that we have so much garbage and sludge in our mental system that we think if what's happening now isn't impacting us as much as that is, that the ton of stuff that we're maintaining, we think it isn't happening, which is just another way of laying another kernel on the pile, another idea in that mix. So the question is, what do you do when you're in the midst of it, if I was hearing it correctly? And it isn't hypothetical because you're thinking of actual circumstances that you've struggled in.
Yes, I can. I mean, I can think of a past situation that doesn't exist right now.
Right. But the thought does.
Yes.
Yeah. So you're thinking about what isn't happening doesn't mean the thought we're having isn't happening. Here's the reinforcement of the absolute. We're always in the present, even when we're thinking we're not in the present. Even when we're thinking about what's happening, we're thinking about what's happening with the present thought. Not noticing that is thinking the impossibility is I have to fix that thing in a past somewhere else that doesn't exist, because all I'm thinking, the content of my thought is the problem, not thinking. I've asked my thought to think about something that isn't happening, and it isn't to suggest that it isn't valuable to contemplate things. But when we're contemplating them and admitting to our experience that they're contemplations of that thing rather than that thing that we need to fix and straighten out, and if it weren't for that thing, I wouldn't be how I am now, where I am now, with what I have now, which is a lie, because we're always where we are with what we have all the time. Then I'm complicating it again by thinking of it as real enough to get there. I'm going to go to even in physics, Gabe, I mean, you can help on this. They constantly think they can go forward in time, but they can't seem to go back. And yet they have telescopes that are showing history, the light from periods of time way before now, but they're only ever seeing it from the present. Those telescopes aren't showing them. They say it's the past, but it's only being seen in the present. It's the same imagination that we have in our own thinking about memories we have that are in the distant past that we focus on and make believe they're all that's happening in the present. It isn't. It's like doing this with your hand, putting it up to your eyes and saying, the world looks like a lot of fingers to me. I can't finger it out. It's just silly. We've misused it. And I imagine in any evolutionary process, because a process is evolutionary, it's always changing. It's a thesis and an antithesis, something that isn't aligned with the thesis. And all of a sudden you've got a synthesis of both. And that's what changes, constantly converging, constantly changing. Everything's always changing. So whatever it just was, it will never be again. And whatever it is now, it's always what it is now. So the only assurance is in the present because it's the only thing ever happening and it's where everything happens. Settling that in your thinking starts to illuminate all these other ventures we take that have no hope in them. So we aren't people that lack in hope or faith or belief. We've been having faith in faithless things. We've been hoping in hopeless things, and we've been believing in things that have no potential, that are literally unbelievable. And yet, when we see things that seem unexpected, we say, that's unbelievable right after we witnessed it happening, as though our own witness of the thing doesn't make it believable, it makes it unbelievable. We talk backward about what we're doing to kind of create this camouflage that the rest of what we're doing in our brain makes sense. So the silence of that knowing that you're referring to, Eden, is the absolute nature of knowing that isn't thinking. So it isn't a process. It isn't changing because it absolutely knows everything. It is everything. It is the essence of everything. And the essence of everything is essential. It is not optional and it's not negotiable. And to concede that is to begin to say, oh, if I'm admitting anything to my innermost self, it would be the self I'm admitting it to is nothing more than a thought I have about who I am. And start to realize, Bill says two things in the book to this point. And anyone listening, I'm referring to the book of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is well worth reading, whether you have a drinking problem or not, because it's addressing this problem from the basis of any problem. And that's why there's at least 200 different 12-step programs today. But Bill said we have to admit it to our innermost self. And he also said that every human seems to have an idea of God deep down inside. Isn't it interesting that the innermost self and that idea of God are in the same place? So what's blocking it? If I think who I am is all I think I'm God. I think ego is God. I say holy shit, and I'm actually claiming that the ego as a shit, meaning a waste product, is divine. And a lot of people, as they begin seeing this through my experience, have said, holy shit, like they're witnessing that we've been speaking in shitty terms, because shit is basically a waste product that a body is designed to get rid of. And if we're constipated, that's tension, not allowing the body to function and relieve the body of the toxic nature. And we're talking about toxic thoughts, and we talk about other people as having they're toxic. I can't be near them. Well, we would not be affected by them if we weren't thinking toxic thoughts, and we would not see the toxicity in them if we didn't have it in our own experience. We wouldn't recognize it any more than we can hear sounds that are beyond our audio capacity, our ears capacity, or colors that are beyond the ability of our visual experience. So if that absolute essence is pure silence and no movement, and yet it's current has another word too, which means it's flowing through our experience, because it's always new. We're witnessing it in time. So it's in our human experience, we're witnessing something present, always new, always new, always new, always new, meaning it's never old. There is no death in this thing because it has no beginning or end. Effectively, it only has an absolute present state of always giving us everything that it is, meaning that all possibility are always possible, period. It isn't new to it. It's just the present state of it is never changed by time, nor is it changed by thought. So the complications of it, seemingly, are only based in thought, not reality. Because reality's always done what reality does, which is be real. And truth is always what truth is, which is to be true. And if we think it isn't, that's a major problem with our thinking about our thinking, about our thinking, about our thinking, not reality or truth. And starting to notice this and just concede it will start to stabilize. Think of something that never changes as pretty stable. There's no shakiness in it. There's no doubt in it. There's no uncertainty in it. And it is not in question. It doesn't need a solution. It doesn't need an answer because it's not in question. It's an absolute state of being. Now, if that's the essence of life, it's pretty comforting to recognize that when we talk about life, that's what we're talking about, not the life forms we have and the things we have and the things we need to make the life form feel better or worse by thinking that more and more and more is going to finally get us somewhere when we already recognize we're always where we are with what we have. And now I have free choice to have whatever I want. And a lot of the impending ideas I have about what I needed all of a sudden to evaporate. They evaporate. And my thinking starts thinking more beneficially of others rather than how can I get what they have? How can I take what I want at their expense? How can I justify ethics being flexible so that I can justify doing things that are not right in the name of trying to get what I want and feel better? And that can be as subtle as basically just trying to convince somebody of our stories that we're telling and think that because they agree with us, we've gained another ally in this fight for who we think we are, when in fact that kills us, just like helping someone else get worse by telling them they're fine and not being honest and saying, look, from my viewpoint, you may have some things to consider that might be worth considering. And be open about it. and say, as long as you think you don't, you're going to probably go down that path that's very dark. And I've seen enough people go down there and I know what happens. So I'm going to tell you what happens down there is not what you think is going to happen. It's not the promise that you think is going to happen. It's generally going to be death at some point, an early death of some point, and or a life that seems like you want to be dead because there's no life in it because of that preoccupation of thought being so experiential all the time, consuming our experience. But it isn't fully consuming it. It's only consuming the thought's attention span.
So am I to question on a daily basis, hearing stories and interacting with people, I feel the idea behind that I'm having is I'm actually questioning what I do on a daily basis when it comes to others and hearing their stories. Why
do you listen?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, if we are having this discussion then what am I actually doing when maybe those others should be having this discussion?
Well, my sense is we participate because we want to confirm the things we're doing that are wrong and think that we're gaining allegiance by having others, listening to them is kind of listening to ourselves. Think about, we say we talk to ourselves, we're thinking about ourselves, we're really just thinking about our thoughts. And when thoughts think of themselves, they're not thinking us up. We're just using them in a way where we're actually considering our considerations. We're actually contemplative. That's actually highly evolved potential that could be turned into enormous innovative results. But if we feel disconnected from reality, the chance is we're not listening to nature. We're listening to what's unnatural, and we're not listening to what's normal. We're listening to what's abnormal. And so the basis of our decisions are creating this conflict that we think we need to resolve by gaining an audience of people that think like us so that we can feel that we're not alone, when in fact the basis of our thinking still has no more substance than theirs does. So that's enabling.
That's the old co-conspirator theory.
Yeah. And that's enabling. That's the essence of addiction, is thinking we're helping somebody while we're actually hurting them. And we're just helping them to the idea that we're a really big help. And all we're doing is coaxing them in the direction of saying, you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. Which we're also saying, you're not okay. You're not okay. You're not okay. If we're not okay now, there is no okay. If we have everything that there is and we're in the only place we can ever be and we're not okay here, that would seem to be something that would be impossible to solve if we keep acting on that premise, which is exactly what addiction is. It's exactly what we do to try to fill a void, but yet we're filling it with the same lack of void because the basis of the thinking is the same thinking that started the whole thing to begin with, and we're continuing to use it. Einstein said you can't solve the problem with the same thinking that created it, and others, by the way, well before Einstein and since.
So what I'm gathering is that the conversations I'm having in certain places should shift.
I think they are right now. You're seeing it.
Oh, right.
And it isn't so much they should, but they will.
Right.
And actually they are right now. You're just noticing that you've got a lot of ideas you've been beholden to. Think of that. We want to be free, but we're beholden to ideas. We take our whole experience hostage, thinking somehow we're going to get a ransom at some point that's going to make it worthwhile, while we are the kidnapper and we are also the hostage. We're the master and we're the slave. And we think the master is going to get better, the better we are as a slave, so we let it continue to beat us, thinking somehow or another, now that proves it's in charge, while we're proving that we're discharged. It's crazy. It's insanity at its core, and it isn't something, we seem to think insanity is only being witnessed by people who are completely incapable of taking care of themselves. But we as a species have come up with ideas that have consistently had consequences we've denied until 50 years later when we're facing them and say, oh, well, they knew it. The Oppenheimer movie is a great example of that. They all knew what radiation was going to be. They knew what was going to happen, but they acted like it wasn't going to happen because their sole purpose was coming up with something. They had a goal. The goal didn't include facing the consequences. That's historically how humans have worked, which is why today we are in a succession of those decisions and facing consequences we don't even want to admit we had anything to do with. What are the chances we've been here doing what we're doing the whole time humans have been doing, whatever we've been doing, and we've had no impact whatsoever? I'm not saying we're the only exclusive impact, but I'm saying it's interesting that people could be arguing that we've had no impact, because that's the same thing we do when we think we're not doing what we're doing in our own experience. We're actually arguing to not exist. We're arguing to say we don't even belong here. We're not even here. We've had no consequence whatsoever. Nothing we've ever done has had any impact. It's insanity. And the insanity is not limited to the people completely incapable of actually fending for themselves and taking care of themselves. It's now in the minds of the people making the policies that are helping perpetuate the problem, because they're seeing it as something distinct from their doing. So the righteousness of the things done are not right. And my experience is righteousness is never right. Why fight for something that's real? It doesn't need a fight. It's already real. The capacity is already there. Aerodynamics were always in place when Orville and Wilbur decided they wanted to figure out how to fly. They didn't say, we want to fly and now we're going to stomp our feet until we do. They said, what's the process to get there? How do we recognize what's out there? They didn't say, we're discovering it. They said, we're just going to make the shape that will make it work. We know the aerodynamics are there. Birds fly. Very different approach than thinking we discovered it, we take claim for it, we get credit for it. No, we've only ever interpreted what actually exists and then figured out that we can do something with it. But a lot of the things we've done with it have had consequences that are corrupt because of the poison and the contamination and all that stuff that comes from it. That same pollution exists in our thinking. We're toxic in the sense that we're actually entertaining and creating poison that is undigestible. Herb Kagan says that an alcoholic can't metabolize sugar, so it's an allergy. He says that the mental problem is not being able to metabolize reality, process reality.
So I have two teenagers. At what point, granted, they're probably past the mark, right? When, like, as if there's an answer to this question, but how do children start to learn this and unlearn, or not be taught what we've been programming everybody to teach and think? And then, I hit 50 and I have to start unlearning. Or does this make sense?
They already know it like we already know it. We just don't think we know it. And so we act like we don't know it. So it's just, my experience is this isn't something you can tell anyone, because they have the final switch as to whether they're going to listen or not. And I know I have pretty good hearing, but I have been listening impaired most of my life. So I've heard what I thought was being said rather than what was being said. And as I've let this go a little bit, it creates a lot more silence. It creates a lot more letting. Humility is about letting things be as they are. That doesn't mean they're more or less. It means they are as they are, period. And if I'm witnessing it and willing to admit that I've been the observer of my thoughts all along, or I wouldn't have been able to notice that they're wrong, if I was in fact wrong, that would be right for my experience. I would feel this is perfect. I'm doing wrong. I am just living at the high point. But it's not that way. We know better because we're conflicted. We're struggling with it. And when we think we are our thoughts, we now think we're in our thoughts. So we've lost complete perspective. And it's kind of like our eyeball. Our eyeball never sees our eyeball. We actually never see our face the way our face is seen, except in a mirror. And we say that's us, but it isn't. It's an image of us. And it's the same thing that thoughts, we talk about, we're reflecting on something. It's a reflection. Thoughts are an image. It's not who we are. It's just what we're thinking about who we think we are. So the kids, do you remember Est, Eden? Werner Erhard, Lifespring, the Forum, all that?
Yes. I did actually.
Landmark.
Yes.
Yeah, well, Werner said in the early days of Est, it was, you went Friday night till midnight, 1 o'clock. You were back in your seat at 8 a.m. Saturday. You were there till 1 o'clock on Saturday night. You went all day Sunday, sometimes into Monday morning, right? That's the adult version. The kids version of all the teenagers, went from like 9 a.m. to 3 on Saturday, and they all got it. They don't have the sludge, the buildup. Good morning, Santiago. They don't have the sludge and buildup caked into their seeming system, which for us is the memory that I've done this so long, how can I possibly stop? Rather than realize that if the moment is absolutely the beginning of everything new, I've never been condemned other than the thought I'm having and the narrative I create. And that narrative, just like a screenwriter or a playwright, takes on this whole version. I'm stuck. I feel like I'm stuck. Think about that. It's like we have our foot in the mud. We've got a bear trap on our foot. We've created this whole imagery to go along with the thinking to give us justification, but all it is a movie in our head. And we know when we go to horror films, we're seeing a horror film and we're still surprised at what we see. We're impacted by those images. They impact us. That doesn't mean they're real. It just means we're creating the potential for our body to react accordingly. It's all that it is. So my experience is, Bill says, attraction rather than promotion. The more I harp on this and tell people that this is what they need to think, the less they think what I'm thinking. The more I remind them that they're able to consider it and just think about it if they want, the quicker they start realizing, oh, I've been thinking about this stuff my whole life. I just haven't known what to do with it. I've been confused, and not only confused, but embarrassed. That was my situation. I was so embarrassed to talk about this out loud because I realized I'd be talking about my insanity publicly. And when I did, it just vanished. I had a panic attack when I was starting to see this because all the fear I'd held in my body just lit up. And my body turned gray one morning, and I was at a coffee shop and walked out the door, and I could see the woman coming toward me almost buckled. Just having that sense that something was really, she didn't see it, think of it, she just knew it. Her whole body dropped. And I said, I'll be fine. And I was just breathing. I am okay. I am as I am is what I repeated. I am as I am. I am as I am. Realizing that source wasn't threatened, but my thinking was really, so much of what I'd held, so much of the gunk was becoming obvious. And it feels pretty sad when all of a sudden you see that you've been wearing diapers and they've been filled for years and haven't wanted to admit it.
But at that point, do you have resentments to being born into a family that allowed this cycle to happen, into school systems that allowed this to happen? But yet it's not their fault because
well, if I think about it in if responsibility is absolute, then coming to terms with the fact that the responsibility I have is not just for me, but everybody. The question is, do I do them any good by using them as an excuse? Or do I start simply claiming that if I'm participating in it all? And what's the best I can do here? Probably not regretting what isn't happening anymore. Probably not resenting what isn't happening anymore. A resentment basically is an idea that things aren't doing what I think they should be doing. That's it. Forgiveness is the same thing. When I'm forgiving, I'm giving something already what it has, rather than forgetting by taking what I think it should be and think that the resentment has something to do with them. The forgiveness is all in me. When I'm forgetting for taking, I forget that I have anything to do with it, right? When I'm forgiving, I all of a sudden realize I've been part of the whole thing the whole time. I started it. I picked the fight. I made the decisions. I've been thinking of it in those terms, and it evaporates. At the bottom of the announcement is a guy named Dr. Christopher Kerr, I think. He's witnessed 1,000 people or so die. He's been a doctor in convalescent care, and so he witnesses people. He says that in his experience, many times the person dying with family around the bed crying is consoling them because they're not afraid. They have slowly come to terms with their whole, he calls it a reckoning, and he called it justice. He said it's almost as though people finally face justice by seeing how their lives went and seeing their involvement in it. What is that for us? The accountability of the fourth step and talking about it publicly, talking to admitting to ourselves, to another person and God what our wrongs are, is the beginning of starting to admit that publicly to everybody if we're being asked to practice principles in all our affairs. It isn't something we do with somebody privately for the rest of our life. The point is get started so you can start to think of this globally. In every respect, Bill says, whatever he's saying, he's basically saying, provided you're willing to grow along spiritual lines. What are spiritual lines? There are no lines. It's infinite. So any line I draw, I need to grow beyond or can grow beyond because I'm the one setting the limit. It's just a limit of my thinking. And as I begin to surrender that and realize the infinite isn't bothered by what I think is bothered by what I think. So if I'm bothered, it's what I'm doing. And if I begin to see that, it becomes laughable rather than thinking there's a persona and a self attached to it that I take so seriously, I need to fight for its life, when in fact the fight for its life is killing me. It's crazy. So part of the silence too, Eden, is that knowing nature does not speak because it already knows. It doesn't have anything to say or choose. What would it choose? It already has everything. It already is everything. There's no choice in that. These are all human conditions that we think of. We have humanized what I remember saying this the first time with Santiago. We've humanized God and dispirited humans. We've turned God into something that gives and takes, that hates and loves, depending on how we behave. Doesn't this sound a lot like a parent or an authority? The police? Somebody telling us what to do, how we need to behave to be able to live within their grace? That isn't grace. That's condemnation. There's no grace in that. The grace is having absolute freedom to do whatever we want, which is why we can go so wrong and still be well within that love's boundless nature. It's just a choice we're making. And it's never something actually happening because we've been delusional about it all along. It hasn't affected God or the universe at all. Only our human experience and everything and everybody we've touched, which is everything.
I think we do that, Jack, because, or at least I did it, because in that way I could have the illusion that I can make a deal with God.
Yeah.
And then I can manipulate God. If I do this, then you will give me that. If I am behaving the way you want me, then I will get what I want. And that's why we, or at least I, humanize God. And that was the road to perdition, truly.
Well, and it's very common. My sense is what we've largely worshipped as God is ego. Because the negotiation we have with the thing we call ourself as an ego is an impossible negotiation. And here we are begging the ego that is made up in our own thinking to finally concede that we're right and give us more of what we want. And we've used that as our God concept. A loving God has no choice. A loving God's already given us everything. We already have it. It's not like we're waiting for it. When people say, well, God doesn't answer, I'm like, this isn't a switchboard. This isn't like a bank of operators that are saying, yeah, God's busy right now, but we'll get back to you. Is there a number we can follow up with you at? That's the Department of Water and Power when they got too many people on the line. It's all human oriented. We've created God wears these big robes. He's got a big white beard. He sits in a cloud. It's crazy. And we have whole theories of this that why would people who have their own theory about that hate other people who don't have that theory if they weren't acting on this exact same basis individually, making believe that it's true for everyone? They're trying to enforce their truth. Like, what kind of God would subject his own creation to parts of the creation, killing other parts of the creation because they weren't built on the same basis as somebody thinks? It's pretty crazy. That's a human thing. That isn't a God or a loving, spiritual, infinite, absolute nature at all. I grew up in the Christian Science church, and all of their churches had God is love in gold leaf on the wall. And I used to say to my mom, why don't these people act that way? There was so much, there was this, and I'm not talking about everybody, but as a kid, it seemed like there was so much stiffness and so much insistence that you look the part and you walk the part and you talk the part and all that. But there was a lot of hostility about what was being done that was tipping back in my chair as a kid in Sunday school was like this heresy. I got kicked out of Sunday school at 3.
Right. Well done.
The beginning of the crusade. But I'm not faulting, blaming, shaming. I'm simply suggesting we've been living in a cauldron of nonsense for so long. And nonsense is a desensitization when we are sentient beings designed to sense, designed to know because we know, designed to have our body know. And to dismiss the sensitivity our body has is to be numb. Numbness when it comes to, if you think of a lot of this I'm going over too for you, Eden, because a lot of us have heard this, and to hear it again, I think may have some benefits, but I'm repeating it just to give you a little bit of a capsule. But in body language, in life, in the life form we have, the instincts are all designed to protect us and save us, to help us survive and thrive. But in the mental obsession end, they turn the exact opposite direction. So it's fight, flight, freeze, and fawn are the 4 basic recognized instincts. So the fight is the reactiveness, the defensiveness. This isn't happening. It shouldn't be happening. I didn't think it was happening. I didn't mean for this to happen. All that stuff. That's the fight. The flight is the compulsion. I got to get away. I got to get better. I got to get over it. I got to feel better. I got to feel everything having to do with not having what I'm fighting. The freezing, which in healthy instinct is being still so you don't get noticed by the bear, is numbness. Acting as though I can it's denial. I'm desensitizing, psychically desensitizing my experience by saying, if I don't think about what's happening, and you hear people say that, I don't like thinking negative thoughts. And I say, well, then you don't have any positive thoughts because they're connected. It's the same thing in different directions. That's all they are. Neutrality is the dead center of both of those. It's not a position on that scale. It's just noticing that the balance of those two things is the having of both, not the one or the other. So I freeze myself. Numbing is actually an awareness of pain, or we wouldn't be numb. But what do? If I don't feel it, like I'm in anesthesia, they can cut my leg off and I don't feel it till I wake up. Because my brain is put to sleep. I'm putting my brain to sleep in the name of saving myself, which in fact, I'm in a coma while I'm walking around as though I'm completely awake. And fawn, which is one that I think Sturgis introduced, is trying to make nice with the threat. You recognize the threat. You think being nice to the threat's going to solve the threat. What is that but enabling? Yeah, you're going to be fine. You're doing great. Don't worry about a thing. Not being honest about what we're saying, just doing this rote backslapping, pushing people along without saying, you know what? There may be some things worth thinking about, considering. That addiction is insanity. It's a mental problem rather than don't pick up the first drink. Don't drink no matter what. When I hear people say that, I say, well, if that had been the case, I wouldn't have needed a program. I just wouldn't have drank no matter what. The program's about how do we live daily? And every day is new. Every day is the potential to go wrong just as well as it is to go right. Every day. There is no insulation to that. There is no freedom from that in the sense that we're condemned to one or the other, because the freedom is having both. It's seeing things in total, integrated, which is what integrity is. It's not dissected, bifurcated. It's about union, about completeness, about wholeness, organic rather than maligned, separate, disconnected, as though they can be. Those are all just thoughts. Everything is intimately woven into everything that's intimately woven into everything all the time within our universe. We're not apart from any of it. We can't be apart from something we're a part of. So this discussion is really, it's not a meeting, it's not anything, it's not a telling of, it's just a talking about. Is a sharing of experience like Santiago. Santiago and I have worked together, 17 years apparently from your last calculation, but the last 3, I would say, very proactively.
I was in 8th grade.
Oh yeah, that's right. But this can be difficult because we're facing things that are difficult, and it can be disturbing because we're starting to look at what's disturbing. And if I'm seeing what's disturbing, I will feel what's disturbed, and as a result be aligned to what's disturbing. And as a result, the channel allows that to be dissolved rather than keep resolving it with feeling better, feeling better, feeling better. What I need to do now is not run 30 miles. I need to run 40 miles a week to feel better. And all of a sudden, I need a knee replacement or a hip replacement. I have a friend who had a heart attack in her 30s trying to be a triathlete. And when we first started talking, she says, I don't have any compulsions. I said, well, that's interesting. Almost every human does, but you may be the exception. And a week later, she said, did I ever mention that I had a heart attack in my 30s trying to become a triathlete? And I said, no, you happen to miss that point. But the point is, we've been doing this sort of getaway thing so long, we really don't think we're doing what we're doing. And to stop and see that we are doing what we're doing can be extremely disturbing. And I'm not suggesting feeling bad here is bad. Feeling bad when it's bad is actually good, and feeling wrong when it's wrong is actually right. And it starts to, if you think of mathematics, a negative times a negative is positive. And a positive times a positive is positive. When they line up, they're positive. They're actually productive. They're applicable. There's purpose. A negative times a negative times a positive is negative. And a positive times a negative is negative. So when they're maligned, they're not positive. And actually, in reality, there is no negative. You can't take away more than exists. You can, if you have 100 apples, you can take 100 away, but you can't have negative. Those are all concepts in thought. Mathematics treats the material world in a bigger way than we think of it, that can actually be treated, but it's contemplating. Mathematics is trying to be contemplative. They're looking for the answer in the universe of how it all works. And I would suggest it's working right now. How about stop looking and begin to admit we're already in the midst of it. We are made of it. And if we actually allowed that to exist rather than constantly search for it through process of elimination, taking 3 or 4 trillion different options and think sometime we'll narrow it down and get the right one, we're already witnessing it. We are already a part of it. And if we were less desensitized to it, we would be expressing it before we even thought about it. Our thinking would just be allowing our body to function in a matter where we would say, wow, I never even imagined that. And I'd say, yes, of course, the imagination was all you were limiting your thinking to that you thought was reality. Of course, we can't imagine it because it's already here. It's already, we don't have to imagine it for it to be as it is. Mm-hmm. So it seems mind-blowing, but I suspect the blowing part is the smoke being cleared from the mirrors that we've been using, the reflections we've been using as reality, covered in the smoke we've been creating. And it just goes away, and you start seeing clearly this has been a human problem for a long time. And Bill Wilson uncovered it, as far as I'm concerned. He put the pieces together in a way that people started getting better with symptoms that had previously been completely incapable of being resolved. Dr. Jung talked about it, Carl Jung, at length. So this has been going on forever, and there's almost nothing that can be done without this vital spiritual experience. And in the near-death experiences, in this other Dr. Christopher Kerr's experience, you start seeing that we almost need to die before we admit this. And my question is, why are we not admitting it now? Well, we still got some life to actually share it and give it and help those others who may not be thinking that. Just give what we can by doing what we can and acting as in ways that we can that become so attractive, because they, like a magnet, just become an awareness of what people already have and they've always been thinking about in some way that they didn't think was theirs.
Jack,
yes, sir.
Can you give me your take on Adam and Eve and the expulsion from paradise?
Well, my sense is it wasn't Eve who ate the apple, because there were 2 men left after Cain killed his brother. And democracy is sort of the nature of existence. It's what people choose. And there were 2 men and 1 woman. They just blamed her for eating the apple. And then, but look at what came out of that, the sort of misogyny and the covering up of women for being afraid of what men are doing. They don't talk about it's kind of like abortion. There's not a conversation saying, gentlemen, why are you not protecting women from your semen when they've given you the benefit of being with them and you don't do anything about protecting them from the potential of pregnancy? We don't talk about that openly. That's the source of the problem. That's where it starts. It doesn't start with women. It's the effect. But in the same way, we don't talk about what they've done is covered women and written women off and all that kind of stuff because they're the problem, but they're afraid of what men are doing. Honor killings in a lot of those cultures kill the woman for being raped, not the man, because it shames the family. Think of that, a shameful act to a family member in the name of being so ashamed for what happened to them by a man who's basically not held accountable. The women have borne that brunt. So my sense is, like everything we've done as humans, when we got our hands on it, we turned the story upside down. And here's another thing. What absolute loving God would condemn somebody for eating the apple from the tree of knowledge? It would be an absolute knowing knowledge. What would be wrong with knowing what God knows? That would be what God gives. It's interesting that to think of that tree as being something that condemned us, while in fact not having complete knowledge as our potential would have condemned us, again, is a reversal. It's a complete flip-flop.
Well, it's the beginning of what I was referring before, of making a deal with that, with God. If you are good, you have reward. You are bad, you are punished. But the story doesn't hold water. To me, looks like. As a matter of fact, I think we have never been expelled from the paradise. We expel ourselves from paradise. Paradise is out there. The sober I am, the longer, the more time I have, the more I can see all the blessings I have.
Yes.
Every moment. And those blessings are not there because I am being rewarded by my higher power because I've been a good boy and I haven't, and I am sober. No, those blessings were there all the time. I just didn't look at them. I didn't pay attention to it. I was in my head, in my thinking.
I'm going to take that another foot, okay?
Mm-hmm.
We have been witnessing it. We have been knowing it because all of the defective, crippling experiences we've been having have been the admission of knowing better. We have just thought of those as who we are because we thought our thoughts were true. We thought we became those things. We became crippled. We became handicapped. We became bad. We became all those things when that isn't the truth. All that became bad was our thinking about our thinking. And so our actions followed suit because we thought it was the only thing we could do. So in a way, you can see the redemption in that always reveals itself. There was no point in time when we didn't know. There were just long periods of time we thought we knew. And what we thought we knew was that we didn't know. That's, another twisted version of the same thing. And here's our body telling us something's wrong, something's wrong, something's wrong. And what are we thinking? I got to get away from this. I got to feel better about this. What I need to do is fill this hole and void. Think about a void that doesn't exist. How much could you possibly do to fill it? There's nothing there. We're addictively attached to the idea that we'll fill something that doesn't exist. That's insanity. It's like digging a hole and throwing the dirt over your back and you're constantly refilling it. You're just, no wonder we feel futile and less than and low self-esteem. These are inestimable acts. They're low value acts. Not actually, if we're fully honest, which I'd like to be, to even give them low worth would give them credit when there's no worth whatsoever. To give them low esteem is credit as having some esteem when there is no esteem whatsoever. And it's starting to see that things that don't exist simply don't exist. It doesn't mean we're not struggling with thinking about things, because every day we're overwhelmed with something that we don't expect and some circumstance that we wish we didn't have happening in some way or another, even if it's just traffic. We miss the light. The guy doesn't make the turn. You know, one of my pet peeves is people sit in the intersection in their car waiting to make a left turn so that nobody else can make the left turn. So here in Los Angeles, we got major traffic problems and a dysfunctional bunch of people driving, blocking intersections, all that kind of, they're rushing to get through the intersection. So they block all the traffic and they're sitting at the back end of a bunch of cars waiting for another intersection that's got somebody sitting in the middle of it trying to get through. So this is all of us at our best, apparently, but I would say we could probably get a little better just looking at it and saying, you know what? I always watch cars rush to the light and then all the cars are sitting right next to each other at the light. Same cars that just rush, cut through traffic, you know, the saving of time is like 40 seconds by the time you're done. There's nothing. But, you know, I see these things and I talk about it. And it doesn't mean that people are limited to what they're doing, but it means that I experience a lot to mention it. You know, my experience is that if it's remarkable, I'd like to remark about it. I'd like to make a remark. I don't want to feel like I'm exacerbating the problem, but I also don't want to feel like I'm being dishonest about something that I can see that's dysfunctional and just say, we could probably do better here. Good chance we could do better. And clearly, if we've been doing things that we thought were real and have no existence, it's not a very high bar to do better. Anything we did that's productive at all and functional is miles better. And I suspect it's why Bill gave us the direction of considering a power greater than ourselves. What would that be? Beyond the limits of our thought. Just to begin to contemplate that gives us a chance to actually recognize we can be free of the compulsions that we thought we were condemned to, because all we were thinking was a thought that was untrue about them. And so we wondered why we couldn't stop them, because we disclaimed any responsibility for them. So we could continue doing them, saying, I'm not even doing this. It's happening to me. It's not happening by me. I'm actually a victim to it. There are no victims. There are no secrets in this universe at all. We secrete everything that we feel that is uncomfortable through our blood, sweat, and tears all the time. People see it, they can feel it, and we know it, which is why we're embarrassed often and seemingly self-conscious. And the self-conscious is defined as undue regard for appearance. Interesting. Undue regard, meaning there's no reason to pay any attention to it at all. It's just an appearance. It's an illusion, another illusion like a thought, masquerading as who we are. And we're embarrassed because we know when we're walking in, nobody's going to see it the way we think they should. They're all going to see something we'd rather they not see. And that's embarrassing. It's hard. We feel that self-consciousness because it isn't actually consciousness we're feeling. It's ideas we have about having given a self-consciousness that has no conscience or conscious. It's just a thought. It's a thought thinking about a thought. Thoughts thinking of themselves do not create us. They create more thinking, which is obsessive thinking. More is never enough, because the more we do, the worse it gets. And we think we're solving it. Interesting. It's like pouring gasoline on a fire. I've got it. I'll put it out. Don't worry.
Well, I'm going to have to go.
Well,
But
we're going to miss the hell out of you, Santiago.
I miss you too, Jack.
Since there's no hell in you.
I want to leave you with a question that has been going around my mind. In the story we've been told and we tell ourselves, starting with the Garden of with Paradise and Dan and Eve. Later on in the story is this guy, and they make films about him and animated cartoons, Noé and his Ark, right? Where he put all these species, all these animals, with a few humans, and God spared him from death. So I've been thinking, in this boat with elephants, giraffes, tigers, lions, bears, cockatoos, I mean, all the animals in the world. And I've been thinking this because I have a dog, and I take him for a walk every day, and I have to clean the shit. So how the hell they clean the shit out of the boat, having hundreds and thousands of animals. What they did with all that shit.
This is the same question.
I've been really considering this and said why the Bible doesn't mention this at all. Because I think it's a very important point. What the hell they did with the amount of tons and tons of shit that these animals produce.
But isn't that a great metaphor for the shit we're talking about releasing by not having thoughts that are a waste product? It's exactly so there seems to be some historic evidence that there was an ark and there was a flood. But humans have typically used stories to prove their point, not because they were accurate, but because they were exaggerated and utilized as an excuse to prove the point. Now, listen, I don't know. The Bible may be absolutely correct. I don't want to say that I know better. I just think it's curious that you have all these contradictions that aren't talked about, but I don't think it's that curious to be not talking about it amongst people who are prone to think denial is actually their savior. That's not odd. That would be normal. It would be normal to go with the party line that's backward to support the thinking that's backward.
Anyway, I will keep considering the question, and if I find a solution of what they did with all that shit, I will let you know.
Listen, today, given the rain coming in, you may see some arcs passing by your house.
Oh, God. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Love you. So this was good.
Okay.
I like the engagement. It's really confirming, and it feels like the ease is obvious. The lack of conflict, the potential to embrace, the potential to inhale and exhale, and to be inclusive and to consider and to allow that expansion to become the natural part of our day rather than the confusion and the implosion and impulsions that come from the impressions we turn into reality and truth that become depressing the longer we maintain them. It just becomes laughable. And my experience, Eden, is that people get reactive to this because we're really stabbing, in a sense, the thing they thought they were maintaining that secured them to life. It's their sense of it's the life preserver that in fact has been a lead weight depressing them and killing them in the name of saving them. So that twisted nature is what insanity is really about. It's really about this undermining effort. And it's my experience is as I focus on people more so, realizing that they absolutely have an inherent knowing that's absolute. They can't possibly exist if they didn't, because it's the basis of all existence. All of a sudden, I'm not looking to convince them of anything, because I'm realizing they know as well as I do, because they've been manufacturing this stuff for long enough that all it takes is that pinprick of a look and say, I have a kid that I've worked with now about 3 weeks. And he said to me last week, he called, he was so upset. He said, I can't imagine. It's impossible for me to come to terms with the fact that I've been doing this the whole time. He said, that would be insane. And I said, bingo. That is insanity at its core right there. You've been doing the thing that's been killing you and creating all of these debilitating effects and thinking you had nothing to do with it and wondered why it continued. And all of a sudden you're looking and saying, you're at the dead center of it. That is absolutely beginning to admit to our innermost self that self that's innermost is buried under heaps and heaps and heaps and heaps of ideas and shit. And even that's just a narrative for this idea that it's somewhere other than here now, to the degree that I think a thought that isn't true is true. It's as simple as that. A lie doesn't require me to be conscious of keeping something from someone. When I become conscious of the disturbance, I can simply admit the lie that I'm keeping. I don't have to admit what it is, who it is, why it is, where it is, when it is, how it is. But now I feel the disturbance. There's got to be a lie attached to this that I'm maintaining, because lies only base their existence on a maintenance of thinking they're true. That causes constant thinking. That's what obsessive thinking is. Constantly thinking about it. So if you look at the experience and say, I'm disturbed, I'm doing something, period. So all I need to do to align myself with it I don't have to do it. I don't need to do it. But if I'm interested in doing that, doing it actually aligns me to what's happening, and I start living with it in a relationship to it that's much more accepting, much more inclusive, much more available, rather than one where I'm constantly trying to figure out how not to feel it and to think about things I can do to feel better when all the things I'm doing that seem to be better are also making it worse. Not only in the denial, but most of those compulsions, if not every single one of them, is a death wish. It's a suicidal tendency. I'm going to eat the wrong foods. I'm going to smoke the wrong cigarettes. I'm going to, whatever it is that I'm doing that isn't healthy, that's compulsive, never is attached to something healthy. Nobody's ever suffered from too much broccoli. Never had anybody come to me and say, I just can't stop eating organic salad and fruit all the time. And what's interesting about that in food is that what I've learned is that the better the quality of the food, the less I eat. My body says thank you, rather than thanks for giving me something that tastes good, but now I need nutrition, please give me more. Thanks for giving me something that tastes good, but now I need nutrition, give me more. The body's screaming for nourishment, and we just keep feeding it stuff that has no nourishing. That's exactly a metaphor for the thinking we're doing that has no basis. A fraction with no denominator is zip, nada, nothing. It's what we're doing in our thoughts. We have no substance as a basis for thought. Thoughts, we aren't life forms. We are substantive in our nature. Forms are what we see with our eyes. The substance is what we understand. Understanding is our other way of seeing. When we misunderstand, we're not seeing at all. We're blind. And actually, we're looking clearly at something black because there's no light. And we're missing the fact that we're actually seeing the darkness perfectly clear. But to do that would say, I'm the one causing it, I'm the one seeing it, I'm the one doing it, versus, I can't see, I'm blind. No, we're blind. We're actually seeing darkness, pitch black darkness, because there's nothing there. There's no light. Very different approach than thinking, I don't know. People argue with me on this all the time. I didn't know until I knew. And I said, no, you didn't think you knew until you thought you knew. Again, thinking thought's the critical issue here rather than knowing. Why would you struggle in thoughts if you didn't know better the whole time, regardless of what you thought? If we can think we don't know, we can certainly think all sorts. If we thought drinking and using was the best thing we could do for years, certainly we're capable of manipulating other situations in time and space that would give us that same impression. I have nothing to do with it. I'm actually arguing not to exist and wonder why I feel like killing myself. So this is kind of fun and also a reckoning, an honest attempt to say, wow, there's probably going to be some disturbing things as we go through this tropical jungle. We don't know what's next all the time. We know that what's next is next, but the circumstances and the things that I've held from myself that I don't think I'm willing to see and all of a sudden start seeing it always seems to be some predicament that's impossible because I've just not gotten used to the fact that I'm always in the present seeing what's happening, and my denial of it doesn't make it not happening. And when I start seeing it, it seems to be unexpected, unwanted, and all that. And I get to go through the process of saying, well, that may be a thought, but if it's here and I'm looking at it, I obviously am doing something I'm ready to actually look at and see. So if you're out there and you're starting to see things clearly and they're disturbing, notice that you're actually willing to see the disturbance that's been there. And that's actually getting better, even when it feels worse. To feel what's bad is getting better. To think what's bad shouldn't be felt is helping bad get worse to the point where it's going to implode at some point in a very, very dramatic way. We don't need drama, to be honest. And we don't need to be right, to be honest. We can speak to untruthful thoughts honestly by simply admitting this is a thought I'm having. Doesn't necessarily mean it's right. I don't know that it's wrong. I'm just having it, and I'd like you to know it. Wow, that's a very trusting thing to give somebody an experience where we're simply telling them what we're doing without trying to tell them they have to believe it, they should believe it, that it's all there is to believe and everything else, but just saying, I'm having a thought. Very different experience. People are very often caught off guard because, like with my wife, when I started doing this, about 3 days later, she said, and I was telling her about something about her, and I said, so this is a thought I'm having about you. This isn't about you. It's a thought I'm having about you. I'm having a thought about you. That thought I'm having is about you. So about 3 days later, she said, I'm having a thought too about you. And it started to actually open up a dialogue that we last night she went with me to my 50th high school reunion. She was born in 1973. So I graduated high school in 1973. So we were coming home and I said something to her that she didn't quite like. And she said, I just went to your 50th high school reunion. You may want to rewind the tape on that comment. And I just burst out in laughter because it was just so fresh and so clear. But she was saying, I don't particularly like hearing that. I feel like I was just doing convalescent work for you. And here, but it becomes laughable rather than this just building of hits in my stomach.
Mm.
So we laugh more. And when it gets serious, we think about it in terms of seeing how our own thoughts are the serious nature, and they wouldn't be serious if they were real, because we don't need to take reality seriously to be real. There's nothing in it. We're creating significance to give it reality, but reality doesn't have any more significance than the fact that it's real. It doesn't think, look at me, I'm great. It just is what it is, as it is. So, kind of fun.
Thank you so much.
Glad to see you today, all of you. And Eden, you know that this is available and we can talk and work and, practice. The practice is in the talking, in my experience. I love to write, but I'm not as good a writer as I am a talker because I said mommy and daddy way before I knew how to spell them. So the experience is a little broader, and my sense is we interact largely through verbal communication. And now I imagine texting is catching up, but I don't think it's as effective. So the talking is interesting because everybody can hear it. And in doing it, I've been in situations publicly where we've been doing it and somebody says, what are you talking about? Like kind of falling into the void. Mm-hmm. And that's exciting to see that it can be inclusive and allow people to see things they might not otherwise think are happening or have always known and recognized it, but just not had words to put to it. Mm. Enjoy the rain today, everyone. Apparently it's coming. Not quickly, but.
Yeah. I'm very grateful, Jack, that you are putting words to this experience for me, with me. Thank you.
You're very welcome. I welcome the opportunity, and this group has developed and devolved over a little bit of time. We started before COVID, and the idea of doing it publicly was a transition from doing it individually, and I began to realize that people became dependent on my conversation with them rather than began to develop their conversation with others in the same way. And it seemed to me doing it publicly allowed for the peer pressure of being seen for what you're thinking and hearing simultaneously. It's much more like we go through our week than in this isolated idea of having one person to go to talk to about the things you might normally talk about. So my sense is Bill Wilson always said, be willing to grow. If we're doing it with one person, he's pointing, as I said earlier, to starting to do it with everybody all the time and just be honest. We don't have to be right to be honest. And there's a lot of freedom in starting to realize that you can admit what you're thinking is wrong and that you don't know how to gauge it until you act on it. Because very often it's the action that actually clarifies the right or wrong. And if I'm constantly thinking in advance of how I'm going to act and not taking advantage of the action, thinking is an action, by the way. It's a primary action that precedes all voluntary actions. But if I'm only thinking about my thinking, I'm not acting out on it. So I don't know how it's relating to the rest of the universe, the rest of the world. I don't know whether it's going to fit yet. I'm not sure. And when I do, I have a very clear perspective immediately that there's some place for it. Because if there's any progress, I don't have to get to the moon immediately if I think I want to be there, and I can get there. But if I'm doing anything accurately in that direction, I will have the confirmation of knowing I'm moving in that direction by thinking about the things necessary that are precedent to that accomplishment, that goal, every little step. And all of a sudden, the steps just become the steps, not impossibilities. And I'm trying to do what can't be done. They're just steps. What am I doing today? What I can do today? What'd you do today? Whatever I could do was done, over, period. It's easy. So what do I do in my day? When I don't like the things I'm going to do, I say, well, that's a thought. But what does it really come down to? That thing, doing that thing. Simple. Just do that. Let it be the thing you're doing. And all of a sudden, it isn't all the things you think it is that would tell you not to do it. Or if you do it, you end up being sort of creating a mess out of it to support the contention that this isn't something I wanted to do in the first place. So it's like we're serving ourselves to ourselves in a way that we don't even want to eat by the time we finally have it on the platter. Crazy is as crazy does. So anyway, I really appreciated this. And I was so glad to run into you, Eden, the other day. And I knew very quickly who you were. And it was kind of a...
I hope you felt or saw what I was feeling. It was very clear. So grateful.
I knew Eden do you remember my sister, Kristen, by the way? Kristen was also part of that group, very platinum blonde.
I'm having different flashbacks. Something came, but I don't know if it's...
Anyway, she was in that. I had sort of forgotten that, but she was in an early portion of sobriety at that point at the log cabin. But I still think you were a teenager.
I was.
When I first met you.
I was.
Yeah. So that was probably 35 years ago.
35, if not, 35, 36. Yeah.
Yeah. And I knew exactly who you were when I saw you.
Oh.
So that was some time. And
I knew you knew without me knowing because I felt it.
Well, I could see there was something going on. I could see that there was a little bit of a light and connection, and it sort of stood out because I always watch the eyes in a crowd whenever I'm speaking and sort of follow them, and they're giving me feedback and an awareness often that I'm not sensitive enough to, but I'm seeing it sort of. But that was good. So I really welcome you, and I applaud you, and I appreciate you, and I want to give what I have to you and anyone else who's interested in it, which is why we do what we do here. So this is a collective of, sort of like a think tank, but we've got the wheels off the tank. They're not those creaky, rambling things with a big cannon on the front of it. It's just a container of potentiality and expression and capacity and love, basically, like Dr. Bob said. So all the steps are love and service. That's it. And what greater service than love? I mean, unbound, always supportive, never ending, full, complete, whole, indivisible, inviolable, immutable. Doesn't matter what we think. It is what it is, as it is. It's not going to change. Shakespeare said, love is an ever fixed mark. When change it finds, it does not change. Mm-hmm. He used altereth because he was like an old English character, but same point. So I love you guys. I'm glad we get to do this, and everyone out there. This is something we can all do together as a team because we're already a team. We're already a species. We're on a planet roaming through the universe. We're traveling right now at over 1 million miles an hour, thinking we're still.
Prayers for Maui.
Thanks, Jana. The picture's been beautiful today.
Yes, thank you.
My daughter and I have gotten over $20,000 in donations to help people so far.
Wow.
Amazing. A lot of sadness, though.
I'll bet.
But a lot of hope and a lot of love.
It was a big bite out of that community.
Ugh. Everybody wants to talk about it, and I said, I'm just doing love. I can't philosophize about it. I can't do anything but feed and love. That's it. Set up tents, put futons in them.
Well, food for thought is nourishing, or can be, just like food for bodies. And that's the beginning of this, is noticing that the nourishment is actually having substantive thoughts and speaking to what is actual rather than what is make believe. And it isn't to suggest we can't make believe, but when it's make believe and it's make believe, there's no conflict. When it's make believe thought to be real, fantasy thought to be reality, that's a problem. It isn't true. It's not going to be true. And we can think about it as long as we want, but all we do is ask our thinking to suffer and our bodies as a result. And we're asking for it. People say, you're asking for it. You're asking for trouble. I've been asking for it most of my life, and I've gotten it. And also expressed it. Not just what happened to me. I was a troublemaker. I was generous. I wanted to share the trouble that I was in. So
kind of you.
Yes.
So generous.
But you know what was interesting last night? Going to a 50-year reunion, which I really hadn't gone to. I went to the 10-year, and I went for like 20 minutes to the 40-year because I wanted to have Katie meet a couple of people. But all of the cores that we grew up with were really caring for one another. There were really little pods of groups of people who really cared for one another. We had 1,100 people in our graduating class. And it seemed to most of us, as we were talking about, we only seemed to know about 50 people, and 50 would be a big group, right? But everybody was very, very considerate of one another, and also cognizant of the differences we all had and the growth we were doing and all that kind of stuff. As wild as we could be, there was a real awareness of a unity and a love and a happiness to say, oh my God, I haven't seen you in so long. And, everybody lit up. There was a very, very different thing than I really expected. And I remember it that way. I mean, I remember school as being a real haven to get away. I said to everybody, I didn't actually go to school. I went to the campus. And then I figured out how to get off the campus so I didn't have to go to school. That was my job.
Most of my donations have been from Venice High buddies, and our graduating class was 1,000 people, and that core is still there. All the Dogtowners have sent something just without hesitation.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. See, what's interesting too is we seem to wait for calamity before we hop in and become volunteers. Just like we seem to wait for our bottom to be so horrible or the pain to be so great before we start acknowledging it. And it isn't necessary we wait, but we've learned we're still using this sense of denial as being a psychic numbingness that we think is really working. It isn't. It's actually depreciating and depleting our capacity to express the fullness that we always have. And it isn't really doing that, but we're making sure it looks like that to support the contention that what we're doing is right. And that's not only sick, it's sad. My sense is we don't grieve the loss of people who transform in this thing we call death. We begin to admit the loss we've been having in the experience, in the moments of actual life, rather than the thoughts we have about our life. That mourning and grieving is actually accumulated in our system. And the freshness, the awesomeness, the absolute intuitive nature basically dispels all those rumors, because there's no darkness in that light. There's no haunting shadows. There's no obstructions. There aren't any things to get in the way to create that haunting idea and those haunting images. And all they are is assumed and projected anyhow. They're not reality. They're just the ability we have to turn our thoughts into narratives and come up with narratives that support the thoughts, and then keep developing them, thinking life is scary and life is impossible, when it's the impossibility of turning those narratives and those thoughts into reality that's impossible. It isn't life. Life is the source of all possibility, which includes the possibility that we think the impossibility is possible. It's completely inclusive of us doing this if we choose to. The question is, why would we if we were sane? And I would say we wouldn't. So the question here is not so much to answer that question, but to simply concede that it's never going to be answered in any way that's fulfilling, because it's a lack of fulfillment that we constantly find whenever we search for a promise that's always broken. And that's what ego is. That's what the lie is. It's constantly wishing for the broken promise to educate us enough and offer us enough perspective to finally admit what we're doing, while we keep hoping and wishing it'll happen in some other way when it doesn't.
I love the concession.
Yeah.
There's so much freedom in it. There's no more conflict, no more fight, no more bracing, no more finding co-conspirators to help me, enable me to fantasize. I just concede and everything gets easier.
Well, and we're always free to do it. And there are, what I find is when the circumstance changes, I'm often caught off guard because I'm dealing with things I don't always expect. And so there's some of that built into the wobbly nature of nature. As a matter of fact, Gabe, I heard on NPR this morning that they have measured the imbalance of a wobbling muon, which is one of the smallest particles in the subatomic structure. But they said it was a 1 in 325 million chances that they would actually observe it, but they were able to. And yet this little thing wobbles, which is one of the basic functions of how reality appears to be real. But it's wobbling in perfectly good order. It's not wobbling out of control. It's just wobbling is like light is vibrating. The particles and the wavelengths and all that stuff, the photons are sort of interacting in a way that give light its presence.
Yeah, the earth wobbles.
Yeah, exactly.
No one seems to notice.
I have a feeling, I had a sense listening to that. My mother would always give me these things to try to figure out. And one of them was, she said, try to figure out perpetual motion, how things can be kept in motion without any kind of energy. And I would say that wobble, I'll bet, is central to that potential to create something that continually moves or could create energy without having to be fed energy. Like most of the energy we have today has to be fed. Plutonium, uranium, coal, all those things are fed into a system that create poison. What if we had energy? The whole universe is filled with energy. There's got to be a way where that energy could be utilized without any toxic byproduct, because it's already being utilized right now. It's the nature of the universe. What are we doing about it? That is, if our relationship to the universe is to think it's a mystery, we're going to keep looking for things that seem hard to find. And then find only things we think support the contention. And if the contention is corrupt, we're only going to find the things that create the contamination and the corruption as a result. If our relationship to it was at peace, we would be notified and informed in ways that we heard rather than misheard by thinking it was only what we thought, and start to actually act in ways that would express this and create this and become a natural part of our normal life rather than an unnatural part of our normal thinking. So I think the wobble has a point in the perpetual motion idea.
Well, it's the conservation of angular momentum. Things that spin can continue to spin and have actual radial momentum on them, like an ice skater is a small example of that. But yeah, it's possible. Get on it, Jack.
I think we're in it. We're in it. The other point of it, if I remembered correctly, was that it was magnetic. And what's interesting about a magnetic is it has positive and negative. One side is attractive, the other side is repulsive.
Yeah, I was just earlier in this conversation, I looked up Maxwell's equation on magnetism.
Well, of course,
talking about it, and all of his.
I was thinking, of course you did.
Of course I did.
Of course, yeah. Gabe. In the middle of the conversation, you'd be looking up Matthew's equation of her.
Maxwell's equations.
Maxwell.
Yes.
Sorry.
All the divergence and all the electromagnetism, they all equal zero. All his equations equal zero.
Right. What does that mean? Perfect balance.
Yeah, perfect balance.
So if there's a repulsion and there's an attraction, the neutrality of it isn't one or the other. It's both simultaneous, which is perfectly neutral.
Yeah.
So that balance, that's the balance, right? That neutrality. What's an absolute state of being? Not out of balance. Perfect stability. It's the actual inclusion of everything. It's kind of like the idea that the old philosophical idea that I think started with Aristotle or before, that if everything in the universe is changing, the one thing not changing is that everything is changing. So the absolute reveals itself when we consider everything, but it seems very confusing and hard to find when we only consider some things. When we're fixated on something, it seems broken. Interesting, our own fixation has things seem broken. That would be a balance. if we're putting them together, saying fixation, broken. Now, what's that? Neutrality, when they're balanced.
That's a good one.
But thinking of them as one or the other, we create the imbalance, wondering why we can't get to balance rather than see they're both the same. Opposites are the same at different extremes. They're just different potential points we can choose. And the neutrality is every point between it if we include every other point in it. And we're actually, when we pick a point, when we try to make a point, we're actually confirming all other points that can be made. We're not excluding them at all. We're confirming that points can be made. Certainly, that would mean all points can be made about the point we're trying to make, which would be contrary to the point we're trying to make. So we're actually confirming all points in the midst of trying to make a point, which is why people generally can't make their point. So they spend a lifetime trying to make it rather than see we're already full of points. The whole point of the point is to have all points. We're already there. That's what knowingness is. It isn't a point. It isn't a place. It isn't a thing. It isn't a for or against. It's just an absolute totality of things in a way that is so seamless that things aren't as they seem. They're as they are. There's no thread in that. There's no stitch. There's no knot. There's nothing that fabric would require to hold itself together. Because this being nature is actually, we're talking about something that is so fluid that it doesn't move, and so current that it's constantly flowing. Seems ironic and twisted, but in an absolute state of being, irony would be the nature of that presence, because it would completely uproot rational thoughts and logic, completely undermine the whole basis of thought. Not by undermining it, but actually distinguishing it as something we're doing in thought rather than something we're being in reality. So if you've ever wanted to be distinguished, you are. If you ever want to change the world, you are. You ever want to make a difference, you are. Right now, it's done. That's over. Nothing else to do. You can go to the movies today.
I just got permission to hang.
Yeah.
Yay, thank you.
I like it. I was going to go to church, but maybe I just hang out.
Just as long as the noose isn't around your neck.
That's true.
For the hanging we do, and the holding on and the concept of hanging.
There is that.
When my first sponsor said, just let go, and I said, what the fuck am I hanging on to? I thought letting go was hold on so tight nobody notices.
Well, and the other thing that people say a lot is like, well, I'm just not going to hang around those people that don't appreciate me the way I appreciate them, or those upsetting people. And I would, in the course, like as if you could go sit on the mountaintop and have a bunch of growth because you're isolating yourself from everybody. And then the gal, Carol, that I study under in the course said, she had that great hour-long speech last night when I was falling asleep. And she was like, you can have no growth whatsoever without relationship, because it's all about projection and mirroring. And it was so open and interesting to me and truthful.
Yeah.
It's how we treat ourselves. It makes you so much kinder to yourself, because that's what you're going to get back. And if you're loving and accepting and in concession, that's what you get back.
When you stop imagining there's a self to love, you begin realizing that love is the nature of our existence, because it isn't distinguished by a self. It is completely inviolable and immutable and in infinite, indivisible. It's what we all share. That's the essence.
The incorruptible essence of who we are.
Exactly. Perfect balance. Perfect. What's interesting about perfection, which we all strive for in this conversation, is if you begin to notice that everything is as it is, it's perfect.
It's so perfect.
And in the present, everything is always as it is. So it's perfect. It just isn't what we think it is or should be when we're thinking it should only be what we think. So
I think I'm more about knowing what things are now, not what I think they are. I know what they are, but yes. I still sometimes think they aren't as I would like them to be, but I'm more in concession. And every moment now, I don't have the illusions that I had 4 years ago or whatever. I know that it is what it is now, but I still occasionally have that step backwards and go, but if this, if my abs were flatter, whatever the fuck, and but I don't see things as they aren't anymore as much.
So this isn't to talk about saying never do that. It's about noticing what we're doing when we're doing it. That's all.
Yeah.
The potential to have thoughts about things is fine. But when we think those thoughts become the things we're thinking about, that's a major disruption to reality in our own experience. But when I think of something, I don't have any obligation to think of it the way that it is at all. I'm as free to think of it in any way I want. But when I recognize it's what I'm thinking about it, not what it is, I realize I'm contemplating. That's actually a meditative state of awareness. It isn't trying to chase thoughts away. It's to start to allow thoughts to entertain things that are actually happening rather than the delusions I make believe are happening and then wonder why thoughts seem to be so tricky and hard that I got to stop thinking. So it isn't about stopping all that stuff. It's about saying, oh, if I'm utilizing it properly, I'm actually noticing that I do prefer chocolate to vanilla. If there's no chocolate, I will eat vanilla, but I have that potential to make those choices. There's real is saying I get to dress the way I want, talk the way I want, say what I want, do what all those things. We're free to do that. When we think what we've done isn't what we wanted, again, there you see this sort of intercession of conflict that comes from thinking all that should have happened was what I thought would happen because I thought my thoughts were truth and reality. The only thing I ever imagined would happen is what I thought. That's a jump.
Or to feel like you should be bummed about something, but you're not. Like, you know what I mean? Like you're almost like, you're like, wait a minute, that didn't turn out how I thought it should be. I should be really upset about this. And I'm not anymore. And it's a weird thing. It's always like, and that's my contemplation. And then I end up dropping to my knees in the middle of my yard and saying, thank you, thank you, all day long. I'm saying thank you because everything's easier and everything just falls together and there's no more square pegs and round holes. And it's so subtle. And that neutrality thing kicked in. So I'm not so manic and crazy in the ups and downs. But I'm super grateful in my neutrality and my concession.
Here's something that's fun too, Jana, is that within the capacity we have to fantasize, we can actually pull the square pegs out of the round holes, recognizing that all they were was imagined, and we can start doing what seemed impossible in our fantasy, recognizing that it's absolutely possible to consider anything we want.
Like the Matrix.
Then you start saying, man, why would I be able to consider that and not start thinking about something I could do and share with everybody that would be valuable? Everybody. Because what's interesting about humans is that when one of us starts figuring something out, everybody else catches up pretty quickly and starts doing it without thinking any more about it at all.
It's cumulative, for sure. It's cumulative.
Yeah, and once we learn how to ride a bike, we don't have to go through the steps of how to. You just get on it again. You may be a little wobbly at first, but we get the drill. So the thinking goes away when we're dealing with things that are real. The thinking is perpetual and grows when we're dealing with things that are unreal, thought of as real. It's just a potential we have. It isn't something not to do. And actually, when some of this started to occur to me, part of it was beginning to realize that I was going to go with the impulses that I knew were wrong. And I started doing that rather than when I had the impulse say, well, that's stupid, I shouldn't do. I started saying, no, that's exactly what I'm going to do right now. And I asked the stupid questions and actually got answers that were so intuitively perfect for the situation I was in that things happened beyond my imagination in terms of the potential of that response. I was given information that was critical that I never would have had the chance to hear if I hadn't stopped. In one instance, I'm thinking about where I had this thought to ask if there was anything that these people wanted me to know before I left. And I thought at first I had a reaction. It was the first time I said, the reaction is the defensiveness. I'm going to ask the impulse. The impulse was the clarity of, do you want me to? And I mentioned something to him and he said, gave me some information immediately about a property that I had told a friend of mine about, who was looking for something. And I said, I know that the night before I said, I know the house, it's not for sale. He tells me the house was just signed to go on sale within 24 hours. Never would have known it. And I never would have had the chance if I had listened to the reactive nature rather than went with the impulse. And I was on my bike and I said, is there anything you want me to know before I leave? And he said, did you know? Out of nowhere, totally unrelated house, nothing. And I said, no, I didn't know that, but I'll have it in escrow in a day. And I was just beginning real estate and realizing I was driving to the office one day and I had this thought that it was getting simpler, but I was still complicating the fuck out of it. I could just sense that that simple wasn't quite simple yet. And I got back to the office and I had run like 1,800 title reports. There's 10 per sheet, and it was 180 sheets or something. And I flipped through it and found a phone number and called a guy who was in Washington, D.C. And they said, he's in the LA office today, gave me the number. And I called him. His name was Stanley Graham. And I said, Stanley, I'm calling you to talk about and he said, aren't you returning my call? And I said, no, I didn't get a message. He said, I called you 2 hours ago.
Oh, that's synchronicity.
And I'd gone past the secretary because I was new in the business. I didn't expect any calls. Somehow he'd heard about me doing development and he had a vacant lot. But the fact is, if knowing knows, we all know. And if we begin acting on it, the things that happen will be so intuitive that it will confirm it and reinforce it. So we won't even wonder whether we want to go in that other direction anymore, because it would be insane to do that. And yet that can be a playground for fantasy, which is where script making and novelists come from, and all the other creative arts come out of that potential to create something to expose the ability we have to explore and to be in an adventure in that exploration, and to fantasize and to imagine, and to innovate as a result and create. All of those things are very much part of our design, but they're upended and turned in the opposite direction when they become the biggest enemy we have, and it becomes our own thinking that's creating that enemy. That's a pretty sick use of something that is so infinitely capable and possible. So it's not unusual to have some tears over this, because there's a bit of a melting of the icebergs that we've been maintaining, that are the numbness and the frozen nature of that numbness. That when you begin realizing you've been trying to protect a pain that was just self-induced and self-maintained, all in the name of this self that we thought was who we are, and it starts melting. My sense was that that's why tears are salty, because they're ocean-going icebergs. They're made of salt water.
But that's a great sentence. Is there anything else you want me to know? I always say to people, I'm not a big phone person, but occasionally I'll be chatting with someone and I'll go, what else? And it's not quite as gracious as yours. I'm going to use yours tonight. Is there anything else you'd like me to know? It's much more gracious than what else. I like it.
Well, I like graciousness and grace. It seems like a good duo.
So amazing. And it's so amazing when I recognize it and I go, wow, that, when I'm all in awe about something that happened that simplified things and made things beautiful and lovely and as they should be and as they are, except I didn't complicate them in that very moment. And then my girlfriend goes, well, you know what that is? That's grace. And I'm like, oh, I gotcha. Beautiful.
Yeah, my sense, grace is that neutrality, the potential for everything to exist in harmony, simultaneously, perfect balance. It's the nature of reality. It isn't something we're given. There, but for the grace of God go I, is the contention that other person does not have God's grace, which means God only gives to some that behave.
But there are no others. We're all one.
Anyway, I love this conversation. I want to continue. I am available. And as you know, for any of you who've reached out and called, and I suspect you all have, and others out there also in the audience, there's an email. If you've got questions, thoughts, etc., want to participate in this morning meeting that we have on every Sunday, but the last Sunday. So we're not going to have it next Sunday, I believe.
And I missed last Sunday.
Yeah. Next Sunday is the last. I think we're back on the 2nd or so. If you'd like to participate directly, it's definitely a different experience than just listening, because the potential to speak is an interactive thing rather than thinking is interactive, but thinking to our thinking in our own experience is different than being in the midst of other people and knowing you have a chance to contribute and speak and open up and say the wrong thing or not know how to ask the question. All that kind of stuff becomes a little easier to get over when you start realizing, oh, of course I don't know. I've never done this before. I don't do this often. Of course I have some questions. Of course I'm falling into the trap of making believe I can't do it because I don't think I know what to do, rather than just launch and do anything and say, well, that was easy. Now I have a better idea. Now I have a relationship to it from a functional capacity, a human functional capacity, rather than just this mental thing. What I generally find is that what I think will happen never happens. And it always happens in ways that are better than I could have thought. Because there's always more happening, even when I'm thinking it's only my thinking that should or is happening. So it's that experience is constantly exposed by simply stepping into it. And again, not having to do the right thing. There's a thing in Alcoholics Anonymous called Rule 62 that says every group has the right to be wrong. Every group is made up of individuals, so we must also have that right. And the wrong isn't to hurt and harm. That's not the goal, but simply talk about what we're doing that may be wrong, but talk about it openly and honestly as a result. We don't have to be right to talk honestly. We can absolutely say, look, this is just a thought. I don't know where it's coming from. I don't know why I don't have to know any of that to have it, and talk about it and share it and start to open up. And the openness from other people that is often triggered is very exploratory and intimate, because now you're exposing and experiencing on an adventure of exploration rather than one trying to refine the stories that are constantly in battle to be heard. No, listen to me. Let me finish. Try thinking that if you get all the details of the story as you see it in their head, they're going to somehow see what you're seeing in your head when you're telling the story. Not going to happen. That's why people say, you never listen to me. I'm like, yeah, you're never saying much.
That's the funniest thing about the dialogue. When you bully someone into agreeing and then they wander off, they're not agreeing.
No, they're numb, just wondering when it's going to end.
I've seen that movie so many times.
And what's funny, Jenna, we call that a relationship.
Right?
Think about that. What are we relating on? Disconnect, alienation, segregation, a lack of inclusion. That is not into it.
No.
Wow.
Yeah, I love you. Aloha. Nui.
Love you guys too. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, Ty.
Thanks, Jack.
You got it, Gabe.
Welcome, Eden.
Thank
Eden,
you.
glad to be in your garden.
Thank you. Love you, Jack.
Bye.
Love you too. Thank you.